In the next part, I want to speak about statistical estimator theory. So this is the study of how our solution that we find by training a machine learning model, y hat, relates to the true function that we are looking for, f. So we explicitly now distinguish between the true function and the estimator. And we say that the observations yi, so the labels that were observed, were generated by a true function f evaluated at the data points xi plus some Gaussian distributed error. And then we have the estimator y hat, so the model that we learn using some machine learning method, such as the linear least squares regression. And now the question is, what can we say about f based on this? So first of all, we learned the function f by selecting a function y hat from a hypothesis set. So we have a certain set of functions that we can represent, for example, by doing a linear combination of feature functions. And we approximate f by searching our hypothesis set for the function y hat that is closest to f. Now, since f can in principle be anywhere outside the observed input, so for any of the unobserved inputs, we do not really have any way to limit where f is. How can we meaningfully speak about the learning problem? How can we say something about the statistics of a learning problem? And the answer is by sampling. So we assume that we have something that generates the data in the sense of the first equation of the slide. So we have a true function, we sample this function somehow, and there's maybe an error involved in the sampling of the function, but we have a certain way to draw points xi and corresponding labels. And we do this for our training data and for our validation data, so for in-sample and out-of-sample data. And we ask the question, if we train our model on the in-sample data, on the training data, do we get a similar performance on the out-of-sample data, on the data that we haven't used for training? Or if not, how far are we away? So this is how we say something about errors. So let us study how these in-sample and out-sample errors generally look like and what quantities they depend upon. First of all, consider that we have a variable number of data points but the same learning problem. So we have some way of generating data points, so generating xi's and yi's, so some way to sample them from a certain distribution. And now we consider differently many data points, more and more data points. And we train our model, for example, our linear least squares model. We obtain a training error, an in-sample error, and we compute an out-of-sample error or validation error, out, using the validation data. So often what we observe is that these errors are different in such a way that the in-sample error is smaller than the out-of-sample error. We assume here, furthermore, that there is a finite error even when we go to infinitely many data points. So that is assuming that our hypothesis set, so the functions that we can represent, is not perfect. And that means even if we train with infinitely many data points, we will still not match the true function f perfectly. If we go towards this limit, the training error and the validation error both converge to this error, to this finite error. But the in-sample error, the training error, typically increases towards this finite error, and this finite error is called the bias, whereas the sample error, or the validation error, E out, decreases towards the bias. And the reason for that is, first of all, there is generally a larger prediction error than a training error. That is clear because we are training on the training data. So we can, statistically speaking, not be better on data that we have not trained on. So at least on average, that's true. But for small number of data points n, or at least for finite number of data points n, we can be always better than our bias because we can, for a finite number of data points, always cut some corners. We can always choose to match the function only on these data points, and we need less expressiveness for that than we would need in the limit of infinitely many data points. So this is why the training error converges to the bias from below. Now, we see that it is not sufficient to just minimize the training error, because the validation error, the out-of-sample error, can still be large, even if the training error is small. So we need to control where the red curve is, how large the validation error is. And one tool to do this is, for example, regularization, that we will speak about later. The true bias, so the bias in the limit of a large data set, is practically not available. But what is available is the out-of-sample error, is the validation error. So practically, this is the quantity we are trying to minimize. We want to achieve best predictions. There is a trade-off between the bias and the variance of a model. So the bias is the error that remains if we have infinitely many training data. Or in other words, if you train the model many times with training data drawn from the same distribution, then the average model will be different from the true model. So you can imagine shooting arrows on a target, and if the mean of your arrows ends up not in the center of the target, you have a bias in your aim. This is what we mean when we speak about bias. The variance is how wide these arrows scatter. So in other words, when we repeat the training process using the same amount of training data but drawn independently from the same distribution, how different will those solutions be? And these two quantities, bias and variance, have a trade-off. So we can often choose to make a small variance if we accept a large bias, and vice versa. And because of this trade-off, because we are interested in minimizing the average prediction error, or the average E out, it is sometimes better to accept a more biased model that has a small variance over a less biased model with a large variance. And that means, especially when we don't have so much training data, so for small values n, it is often better to use a smaller or less expressive model that has some bias, but that doesn't scatter so much. Asymptotically, when we have more and more data, so for large training set sizes n, we can afford more and more complex models. So the optimal model, in the sense of minimizing the prediction error, will be more on the side of more complex models. So overall, the optimal model selection, or the hyperparameter selection problem, depends on the amount of training data n. It is for a given training set. Now, we have seen that the prediction error, or the out-of-sample error, has a bias and a variance component. Now we would like to analyze those components more quantitatively, and particularly for the linear least squares regression problem, we can actually do that in quite some detail, and we will do this here. So here we look at the out-of-sample error, the validation error, which is the value of the cost function evaluated at the validation data, as you see here. So these are the validation data labels, y val, and the predictions, y hat val, on the validation data, but using the parameters that have been obtained using the training data. How do we do this? How can we say something statistically relevant about the validation error E out? And the idea is the following. We say we define the set of data on which we operate. So essentially the data X, the inputs X are fixed. Now we say the model, whenever we sample such a data point and we obtain the label y, we have to follow the generative model given here. Y equals f of x, so f is given, plus an uncertainty or error epsilon that occurs IID, independent, identically distributed, whenever we take such a sample. And we simply repeat taking samples using the same input data x. So we fix xi, and then we repeat, run the experiment. So run the observation experiment, observe the training data x and y train for n data points, and train the estimator, obtain the parameters this way. Now we repeat the same experiment. We use the same input data x, but we sample the output or the label values y again, and these will now serve as y val. So now we can compute the validation error. And now we do this many times, and we compute the expectation value over many noise realizations. So we compute the average out-of-sample error by repeating this experiment. And this is something that we can evaluate for simple estimators like the linear least squares estimator. And for this, we can actually go into quite some detail and analyze the mathematical form of this average validation error. So let us analyze the expected validation error. So here we compute the expectation value of the sum over samples of the square difference of the label at the validation data point and the prediction of the model. Now on the right hand side, we just rewrite this sum where we add and subtract the true function f evaluated at xi to each term. So in sum we have done nothing, but now we can decompose the argument of the square into different terms, and we can use the binomial formula to split this sum of squares, and we assign the minus and the plus f to different parts because this turns out to be useful for getting a simpler expression. Now if you apply the binomial formula to this sum over squares, we get the following. We get three terms of sums over expectation values. The first term is the sum over expectation values, where we compute the square difference of the label at the validation data point and the true function. But the label at this data point is simply given by the true function plus a Gaussian distributed uncertainty that happens when we take the measurement. So what we have is simply the expectation value over the squares of these measurement errors, or the noise. So we call this term sigma epsilon square. The third term of the decomposition is also simple. It contains a multiplicative factor, which is the expectation value of the difference of the validation point label and the true function. But this difference is on average 0 because we use a Gaussian error model, and the mean of a Gaussian is 0. So since we don't have the square in this expression, but just the expectation value of the difference, this is 0, and the whole term disappears. So what we are left with then is the second term, and that is more interesting. That is actually the sum over expectation values of the true functional value at xi and the prediction, the model prediction at xi squared. And this depends on our machine learning model, on our parameters. So in sum, we have the noise term, which is simply an artifact of the way we measure data, and it does not depend on parameters. So there is nothing we can do about this term with machine learning. We cannot influence the size of this term. But what we can influence and what we can change by the way we perform the machine learning is the estimator error, which is the difference between the true functional values and our predictions. So let us analyze this term in more detail. Let us analyze the estimator error in detail. So we have the expectation value between the square difference of the functional value, the true functional value at xi, and the model prediction at xi. Now we do the same trick as in the slide before. We add and subtract a certain term, and the term that we add and subtract here is the expectation value of the model prediction at xi, and the expectation is taken over many realizations of training and validation. So we add and subtract these terms. We group the sum into terms A and terms B, apply the binomial formula, and we get these three terms: expectation value of A square, of B square, and of AB. Now we abbreviate the mean model prediction at xi with yi bar, and we can then show the following. So first of all, the mixed term expectation value of A times B can be shown to disappear. If you look at the sum of these terms in detail, you will see that they add up to 0. So we can ignore this mixed term. We are left with the expectation value of A square and B square. The first term, the expectation value of A square, turns out to be the sum over square differences of the true function values at xi and the mean model prediction. So this is the bias of the model. Remember that when the average prediction of a model, so yi, is identical to the true function value, that means that the model is unbiased. The predictor is unbiased. So it is consistent with the true function in the statistical limit. And if that is not the case, the model is off on average, so it has a bias. So this term is the bias term. To be exact, it's the bias term squared. The last term, the expectation value of B squared, is the variance term. It measures how strongly the estimator fluctuates on average. And it is the sum of the expectation value of the square differences between the mean estimator prediction, yi bar, and the individual estimator predictions, y hat xi. Yeah, so every time we make a training and prediction of the machine learning model on the validation set, we obtain a prediction y hat. So this prediction y hat fluctuates. It will be different every time we repeat the procedure of training and validation. But the mean prediction, y bar, is constant. It is something that we obtain as a mean value over all of these repetitions. So the differences between these two numbers tell us how much the predictor or the machine learning algorithm fluctuates. And because we take an average over the squares, this will not be 0 on average, but it will be a finite difference. And this value is called the variance. It is really the statistical variance of the estimator around its mean prediction. Now we can combine these expressions and write the expected out of sample error or the expected validation loss of the model as follows. So again, we just write the definition of the expected loss, the expected validation loss, which is the expectation value over all the samples of the square differences between the labels at the data point xi and the model predictions at the data points xi. And we have seen this can be written as the sum of three terms: the bias, the variance, and the noise. The noise is a quantity which only depends on the measurement process itself, so it contains measurement errors, but it does not contain any machine learning parameters. So we cannot remove this term or reduce it by machine learning or by changing anything in our model. We have no control over this. But we have control over the bias and the variance term. And the optimal model is a model that minimizes the expected validation loss, and it therefore has to balance between the bias and the variance term. It has to avoid that either of them grows very big, because it needs to keep the sum of the two terms small. A model that has a large bias term is a model that is underfitting the data. It is strongly off on average. A model that has a high variance is overfitting the data. It may be correct on average or over many repetitions of training and validation, but the individual predictions scatter a lot, so the expectation value of the expected validation loss, the expectation value of the out-of-sample error is still large. So we have to avoid both. We have to avoid underfitting and overfitting by keeping the sum of the bias and the variance term as small as possible. And the relative contributions of the bias and the variance term, that will depend on the amount of data that we are using. Since data is often limited, a simple model with a finite bias, so an asymptotic error, may be preferable to a complex model with a high variance. But as we have more and more data, then more complex models are optimal, because the variance then reduces, and therefore we can also reduce the bias. For a fixed amount of training data, we have already seen that the expected validation error has an optimum for intermediate model complexity, and there is underfitting below this optimum and overfitting above this optimum. Now we can understand this behavior better because it is a sum of two contributions that are playing against each other, the bias and the variance. The bias is a quantity that is large for two simple models and reduces for more complex models or models that have more expressiveness or more degrees of freedom to fit the data. And it will go towards 0 for an arbitrarily expressive model that can exactly represent the true functional values that generate the data. On the other hand, a simple model has a small variance, and a complex model with a lot of degrees of freedom has a high variance. So in terms of model complexity, or as a function of model complexity, the bias decreases and the variance increases, and their sum gives rise to this minimum expected validation error or minimum E out for intermediate model complexity. So the findings we have discussed so far are quite general. We have understood the prediction error or the expected validation error in terms of bias and variance. We have understood that these terms play against each other, and we can control them by changing the model complexity or the number of degrees of freedom of the model. This is something that is generally true in machine learning and in statistical estimator theory. But now, if we are talking about specific machine learning models or specific estimators, we may be able to actually compute these terms, like the bias and the variance term, explicitly, and we can relate them to the parameters or the measurements we have at hand. Now, let us do that for the linear least squares regression. And for linear least squares regression, we have an explicit form of the estimator, shown here. The optimal set of parameters is equal to the pseudo-inverse of x multiplied with the labels y. Now we can write down the bias expression for every single data point, that is the difference between the true function f at the data point xi and the expected prediction of the machine learning model at this data point, so expectation over many training and prediction runs. If we just insert the estimator shown above at the point where the machine learning model makes a prediction, then this is the expression for the bias that we get. Now we do two things. So first of all, we assume that our set of features that we have used to represent y is perfect. So we can actually represent the exact function f with our chosen features. Secondly, we use our linear least squares model for expressing what y is. So y is equal to xw plus a measurement error epsilon, which is on average 0. We insert these things into the bias expression, then do some linear algebra, as you see in these 5 lines here, that I encourage you to follow in some detail. And you can then see that the bias is on average 0. So the least squares estimator is on average or asymptotically unbiased. Let us do the same analysis for the variance of linear least squares estimators. So for a single data point xi, the variance is the expectation value of the individual model prediction at xi and the mean model prediction squared. Now again, if we use the linear model, f of x is x transpose w, with the least squares regression estimator that we have already shown in the last slide. And now we additionally use the result from the last slide that our estimator is asymptotically unbiased. So the mean estimated value at point xi is equal to xi transpose w. Inserting this into the variance expression gives the result shown here. And if we additionally insert the observation model that every point y, every label y, equals xw plus the measurement error, we can formulate the variance in these 3 steps here. Now we do a few more algebraic analysis steps and use some of the matrix properties. For example, that x transpose x is a symmetric matrix. And we obtain the following expression for the variance. The variance contains the covariance matrix of the data x. it contains how every single data point xi interacts with this covariance matrix, and it contains the magnitude of the measurement error as a prefactor. This result is still quite general and it's quite useful, but we can go one step further and do a statistical analysis of these properties that I will only sketch here because it is quite technical. So basically we take the covariance matrix, we do a principal component decomposition of the data by doing an eigenvalue decomposition of this covariance matrix. And we use this result to rewrite the estimator variance over a sum of components of single eigenvalue eigenvector components. We then make a few more assumptions about the statistics of the data here and eventually obtain the result that under those assumptions the variance, so the expectation value of the variance, is equal to the noise factor multiplied with little n divided by capital N. So little n is the dimension of the data and capital N is the number of data points. And this is a quite typical expression for the variance of an estimator. The variance grows linearly with the dimension of the problem. So higher dimensional problems are harder to estimate. They give us more variance in the estimator. But the variance of the estimator also decreases linearly with the number of data points that we have to fit the data. It can further be shown that this linear least squares estimator that we have talked about is the estimator that has the minimum, so the smallest possible variance across or among all estimators for least squares regression that are unbiased. And because of that, it is called the best linear unbiased estimator, also abbreviated as BLUE. But this does not mean this is really the best estimator for linear least squares. It just means that it's the best estimator for linear least squares that is unbiased. So that has zero bias if you keep, or zero error if you keep collecting data and make capital N very large. For a finite amount of data, so especially if capital N is quite small, there may be estimators that have a smaller prediction error but have a finite bias. So with this, we are done with our statistical analysis of linear least squares regression. To recap again, it is important to understand that there is something like expected prediction error that we want to minimize, or an expected validation error that we want to minimize. And this expected prediction error has a bias and a variance component that play against each other for a fixed amount of data n. And the biased component typically decreases with increased model complexity, whereas the variance component increases with increased model complexity. And our aim is to balance them to make their sum small.